On an October afternoon in 1951, York County smelled of apples. Heat from the oven carried cinnamon and butter through the cloth curtains. An apple peeling knife lay beside the cake pan, along with a white enamel bowl streaked with dried sauce and ruled index cards. She spooned applesauce into the batter and tested the top of the cake with her fingertip. On the shelf, the recipe box sat with its lid slightly open, holding cards marked with dishes, prices, and grease stains. They left out the thickness of the sauce, the sound of fat sizzling, the moment onions turned sweet, and the weight of a spoonful of pudding. You don't need to open the recipe. You need to know what the kitchen is telling you. Coming up, cake number 30 is judged done by its smell. Balls number 24 contain rice, beans number 20, stuffed peppers number 11, soup number 2, and milk bread for feverish nights. If memory still means something, subscribe to Old American Kitchen. Tonight, recipe box open. Pull a chair close to the stove. Applesauce, vinegar, and the cake judged by their aroma. York County, Pennsylvania, in the fall of 1951. Apples were being carried down to the cellar. Stale bread sat in a tin box, and on the shelf were flour, sugar, cinnamon, vinegar, tomato soup, and a few eggs. The mother of a family of cannery workers cooked with movements that had become part of her memory. To her, the smell of cinnamon and the tremble of a pan were more trustworthy than the face of a clock. Dish number 30, Pelsay cake. The smell of cinnamon had already reached the kitchen curtains before the oven door. Soft sound. In 1951 in York County, a pound of apples cost about 11 cents, 5 pounds of flour cost nearly 52 cents, and 5 pounds of sugar cost about 51 cents. She stirred the applesauce with sugar and fat, sifted the flour with cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, and folded the dry ingredients into the wet mixture. When raisins or nuts were available, she added a small handful. The batter was poured into a greased pan and baked until the top sprang back beneath her fingertip. Applesauce kept the inside of the cake moist through many slices. She knew the cake was done by its smell. Dish number 29, Key-style eggless chocolate cake. 3 small wells appeared on the surface of the flour mixture. In that same kitchen, flour still cost about 52 cents for 5 pounds. Sugar cost about 51 cents for 5 pounds. She mixed the flour, sugar, cocoa, salt, and baking soda directly in the pan, then made 3 wells with the tip of a spoon. Oil went into the first well, vinegar into the second, and vanilla into the last. Water was poured over the mixture and stirred until the white streaks disappeared. The recipe left out eggs, butter, and milk, but the cake still rose when the vinegar met the baking soda at the right moment. The knowledge lay in the order and the proportions. The cake lifted itself. Dish number 28. Tomato soup cake. The newly opened can of red soup gave off a faint metallic smell, which was soon buried beneath cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. In York County in 1951, a can of condensed tomato soup usually cost about 10 to 12 cents. She stirred the soup with flour, sugar, and fat, added spices and raisins, then poured the mixture into a pan. In the oven, the pale red color turned dark brown. The tomato provided moisture and acidity to keep the inside of the cake tender, while the spices did the rest. When the cake was sliced, the red color still hid within the crumb, but the smell of tomato had already left the room. Dish number 27. Bread pudding. The cinnamon came alive in the bowl of milk before the slices of stale bread could dry any further. White bread at the time cost about 15 to 16 cents a pound. Milk cost about 22 cents a quart, and eggs cost nearly 70 cents a dozen. She tore the bread by hand, soaked it in milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla, and added raisins. The bowl was left undisturbed so the bread could absorb the milk before the mixture was poured into a pan. She adjusted the amount of liquid according to how much bread remained, watched the surface gradually turn golden, kept the center soft, and let the edges against the pan become slightly crisp. The spoon sank into the smell of cinnamon and the steam of milk. No slice of bread ended as it had begun. Dish number 26, rice pudding. The pudding dish trembled slightly in her hands, while the smell of nutmeg remained still in the milk-scented steam. Rice cost about 18 cents a pound, milk cost about 22 cents a quart, and eggs cost nearly 70 cents a dozen. Cold-cooked rice was mixed with milk, sugar, eggs, and spices. Then raisins were scattered evenly throughout. The dish went into the oven, and the soft sound of enamel touching the metal rack rang out. She lifted the dish and gave it a gentle shake. The center had to be set, but still moved softly. Some households ate it warm, while others chilled it. The proportions changed according to how much rice was left. Cold rice never remained for long. 5 sweet dishes had passed through the York County kitchen, with cinnamon, vinegar, milk, and food that could still be used. And the factory whistle echoed through the late afternoon. The cake pan was set aside, making room for a heavier cast-iron skillet and a pound of meat that was about to take 5 different forms: ground beef, rice, and the cast-iron skillet, after the factory whistle. The factory whistle had barely faded behind York County when the story shifted to Detroit, Michigan in 1952. The kitchen of an automobile assembly line worker's family. The mother listened for every car that stopped outside on the street. Some evenings her husband returned, while the pot of food was still gently simmering. On other evenings, the lock clicked after the young children had already left the table. She needed dishes that could stay warm on the stove, withstand a second reheating, and still have enough flavor for the person coming home late. 1 pound of meat made its way through 5 dinners, taking a different form each time. Dish number 25, American-style goulash. The pot lid was lifted, and tomato-scented steam immediately fogged the window pane. In Detroit in 1952, 1 pound of ground beef cost about 63 cents, while a can of tomatoes cost around 18 cents. She dropped onions into the pan and listened as the sizzling spread beneath the layer of fat, then browned the meat and broke it into small pieces with the edge of a spoon. Tomatoes, water, and macaroni were added afterward. The lid went back on, trapping the heat inside until the pasta had absorbed nearly all of the red sauce. When there were bell peppers or beans left in the cupboard, she added a little to make the pot fuller. The dish could sit on the stove until the end of the work shift. Overnight, the macaroni continued absorbing the sauce, while the flavors of onion and meat settled more deeply into every piece of pasta. It often tasted richer on the second day. Dish number 24, porcupine meatballs. White grains of rice protruded from the meatballs as the sauce began to bubble around the sides of the pot. Ground beef still cost about 63 cents per pound, while rice was nearly 18 cents per pound. She mixed the meat with uncooked rice, egg, onion, and seasoning, and shaped it into balls that fit in the palm of her hand. The meatballs were placed in a pot, covered with tomato sauce, and simmered slowly. In the heat, the rice absorbed liquid, gradually swelled, and pushed the tips of the white grains outward like tiny quills. The young children often leaned close to the table to look at their shape before picking up their spoons. For the mother, rice helped stretch the meat across more plates. For the children, it was a dish with a memorable appearance. Rice did the work of meat. Dish number 23. Toast topped with ground beef gravy. Before a night, brown gravy was ladled over slices of bread fresh from the oven. At the time, ground beef in Detroit ranged from 63 to 66 cents per pound. Bread cost about 16 cents per pound, while milk was nearly 22 cents per quart. She browned the meat with onions, then sprinkled flour directly into the hot fat. The spoon scraped lightly across the bottom of the pan as the milk was poured in slowly. She stirred until the gravy was thick enough to cling to the spoon, then ladled it over crisp toast. A modest amount of meat was evenly divided among each ladleful of gravy. The bread absorbed the hot milk, while the top held the meat and onions. The portion of meat was small. The plate was full. Dish number 20. Tenderized steak with gravy. The steady pounding of the meat mallet sounded across the table after the end of shift whistle. In 1952, round steak cost about $1.11 per pound. She placed each piece of meat on the cutting board, pounded it to loosen the fibers, then coated it with a thin layer of flour. Both sides were browned in the cast iron skillet before being removed. Flour and milk went into the hot fat, forming a smooth gravy that grew heavier beneath the spoon. The meat was returned to the skillet, the lid was lowered, and everything braised slowly until the tip of a fork passed through easily. The tenderness came from the strength of her hands, the coating of flour, and the quiet time beneath the lid. She did not buy tenderness, but she created it. Dish number 21. Fried bologna. A slice of bologna tightened in the hot skillet, its edges curling upward like a small bowl. Half a pound of bologna cost about 29 cents at the time, while white bread cost between 14 and 16 cents per pound. She cut a short slit in each slice so the center would lie flat against the skillet. The bologna was fried until the edges browned and turned with a fork darkened by years of use. When onions were available, she sliced them thinly and dropped them into the fat, allowing their sweet aroma to rise through the gentle sizzling. A slice of meat could be tucked into bread, placed beside eggs, or eaten with beans. Heat made the surface crisp, deepened the smell of the meat, and gave a cold food the feeling of a freshly cooked meal. Heat did the work of price. 1 pound of ground beef and a few slices of bologna had taken 5 different forms, Detroit kitchen. As the cast iron skillet slowly cooled, the story shifted eastward to South Boston. There, butter, flour, milk, and toast would open the way to 5 different plates. White bread, milk sauce, and one technique that made 5 suppers. Leaving the Detroit kitchen, the story moves toward the docks of South Boston, Massachusetts, in 1951. In the home of a shipyard worker, the sound of metal from the docks could sometimes still be heard when the mother began preparing dinner. During the final days of the month, she kept white bread, milk, flour, butter, a few cans of fish, and a block of cheese on hand, so that the same group of ingredients could serve several different meals. The recipe box was taken down for the second time. The wooden lid brushed lightly against the shelf. A card softened at all 4 corners appeared, with 3 words written on it in pencil: butter, flour, milk. A streak of white flour remained along the edge of the paper, where steam had caused the corner to curl upward. The card gave no measurements or cooking times. Her hands had to recognize when the flour no longer smelled raw, when the milk was hot enough, and when the spoon could draw a clean line across the bottom of the pot. From that technique, 5 plates appeared one after another. Dish number 20. Creamed peas on toast. Green peas fell into the pot, changing the color of the white sauce beneath the kitchen light. In 1951, a 12-ounce package of frozen peas cost about 24 cents, while a pound of bread cost nearly 16 cents. She melted butter over medium heat, sprinkled in the flour, and stirred until the raw flour smell softened. The milk was poured in a little at a time, with each addition waiting until the mixture became smooth again before more was added. Only when the sauce was thick enough to coat the spoon did she add the peas, keeping them green and firm. Slices of bread were toasted until crisp, placed on plates, and covered with ladlefuls of hot sauce. It was an end-of-the-month dinner when the meat compartment was empty. Even so, every step was done carefully. The pot still did everything it needed to do. Dish number 19, creamed dreed beef. The smell of black pepper mingled with the salty meat and rose through the milk-scented steam. A quart of milk at the time cost about 22 cents. Bread cost nearly 16 cents a pound, and butter cost about 85 cents a pound. She tore the dried beef into small strips. When the meat was too salty, she quickly soaked it in water then drained it on a clean towel. The white sauce was stirred slowly, and then the meat was added so it could gradually soften in the milk. Black pepper was sprinkled in at the end, allowing its sharp aroma to rise just before the dish was served. The bread had to be crisp enough to hold the hot sauce without becoming soft beneath the first ladleful. The dried meat that had once sat quietly in the cupboard now carried its salt evenly throughout the pan. After the plates had been cleared from the table, the smell of pepper still remained in the kitchen. Dish number 18, creamed tuna with peas. The flakes of tuna shifted gently as the spoon moved across the surface of the sauce. In the early 1950s, a can of tuna usually cost about 30 to 31 cents, while a tall can of evaporated milk cost about 12 cents. She drained the liquid from the can, flaked the fish with a fork, and gently folded it into the sauce so that the individual pieces remained intact. Peas were added last. The dish could be spooned over toast, crackers, or noodles, depending on what was available in the cupboard. The sauce divided the fish into several smaller portions, while the bread or noodles provided a base that made the meal more substantial. One can could be spread across 4 plates, with each plate still holding warmth and a faint smell of the sea. Dish number 17, well-styled cheese. Toast melted cheese flowed into the small grooves on the surface of the bread. A pound of cheese in South Boston at the time cost about 59 cents, while bread cost nearly 16 cents a pound. She grated the cheese into a pot, then added butter, milk, mustard, and a small amount of Worcestershire sauce. The spoon moved steadily until the mixture was glossy and smooth and held the fat within it. Bread was toasted first, and then the cheese sauce was poured slowly over it until the entire surface was covered. The name of the dish recalled an old tradition from across the Atlantic. In an American working-class kitchen, it became a way to make bread and cheese look more presentable beneath the dim light. The elegance was in the ladle. Dish number 16, broiled cheese toast. The children stood near the oven door, watching the cheese bubble on each slice of bread. Cheese still cost about 59 cents a pound, while bread cost between 15 and 16 cents. She placed cheese on the bread, added a thin layer of mustard or a few slices of tomato when they were available in the house, and then placed the tray beneath the broiler. She stayed close to the oven, watching the surface puff up. The edges of the bread turned brown, and drops of cheese began to bubble. The dish appeared quickly after school and was sometimes served with a bowl of soup in the evening. The moment the tray was removed determined whether the cheese remained soft or became burnt around the edges. She knew exactly when to open the oven. 1 kind of sauce, 1 loaf of bread, 5 dinners had passed through the South Boston kitchen. The recipe box was returned to the shelf while the small pot slowly cooled. In Cedar Rapids, Iowa, heavier glass baking dishes were waiting. The oven would continue cooking while the mother stepped away from the kitchen to do work. Potatoes, canned beans, and the casseroles that did the work on their own. From the small pot in South Boston, the story traveled toward the railroad lines of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in 1952. In the kitchen of a family supported by railroad and meatpacking plant work, mother kept 2 glass baking dishes on a low cabinet shelf. One usually remained on the dinner table. The other was covered with a cloth and carried to the church basement, to a neighbor's house, to a home that had just welcomed a new baby. Once the oven door closed, she could turn to washing clothes, clearing the table, or caring for the young children. Oven cooked the food while buying back a little time for her. Dish number 15, scalloped potatoes with ham. The last piece of ham rested between layers of potatoes sliced thin with a knife. In 1952, 15 pounds of potatoes in Cedar Rapids cost about $1.14, while ham cost nearly 65 cents per pound. She layered the potatoes with onions and small slices of ham, spreading the meat throughout the entire baking dish. The milk sauce was poured slowly into the spaces between the layers, leaving a pale sheen across the surface of the potatoes. The dish was covered during the first part of the baking time. Near the end, she removed the cover, heard the heat rush upward, and allowed the top layer to turn golden brown. Ham from Sunday dinner had taken on another form, but its mild, smoky flavor still rested between the layers of tender potatoes. Sunday dinner was not over yet. Dish number 14, shipwreck casserole. The baking dish grew heavier as each layer of raw ingredients was placed inside. 1 pound of ground beef cost about 63 cents at the time. 15 pounds of potatoes cost about $1.14, and a can of tomatoes cost nearly 18 cents. She spread the meat across the bottom, added potatoes, onions, tomatoes, and rice, and seasoned each layer before covering it with the next. The tomato juice seeped through the spaces, while the rice rested underneath, waiting to absorb the liquid as it baked. The cover was placed on the dish, the oven door closed with a low thud. She left the kitchen to attend to the work that was waiting. When she returned, the rice had swollen, the potatoes had softened, the smell of cooked onions had spread into the hallway. The oven worked the second shift. Dish number 13. Baked suet and beans. The beans bubbled beneath slices of sausage whose edges were beginning to curl. Sausage in Iowa in 1952 cost about 64 cents per pound, while dried navy beans cost nearly 16 cents per pound. She stirred the beans with brown sugar, mustard, and ketchup, allowing the sweet and salty flavors to blend together. The sausage was cut into rounds, arranged in rows across the top, and placed in the oven. Through the glass, the sauce gradually darkened and thickened around the sides of the dish. The meal could appear at a family dinner, on a table in the yard, or in the middle of a large gathering. When the spoon reached the bottom of the dish, the caramelized sauce around the edges was usually taken first. The edges were always the first to disappear. Dish number 12. Scallop corn cracker crumbs turned golden over a tender layer of corn and milk. A can of corn cost about 19 cents at the time, a dozen eggs cost nearly 67 cents, and a quart of milk cost about 23 cents. She beat the eggs with milk and butter, added the corn, and crushed the crackers by hand. Some of the crumbs were folded into the mixture to give it structure, while the rest were sprinkled evenly over the top. In the oven, the corn mixture slowly set, while the crumbs made a very faint crackling sound. From 1 can of corn, she made a baking dish large enough to share among many people. It stayed warm for a long time, held steady while being carried to another home, and often returned with the bottom scraped clean. An empty dish was a thank you. Dish number 11. Stuffed bell peppers. The green peppers stood upright in the baking dish like small cups. Ground beef cost about 63 cents per pound, rice nearly 18 cents per pound, and tomatoes about 27 cents per pound. She cut off the stems, removed the seeds, and mixed the meat with rice, onions, and tomatoes. The filling was packed in with just enough pressure to leave room for the rice to expand, while still holding against the sides of the peppers. Each pepper was arranged neatly in the dish and baked until the skin softened and wrinkled slightly around the opening. She recognized the right amount of filling by its weight in the palm of her hand. When the fork cut through, the meat, rice, and tomatoes came away with a piece of green pepper skin that had absorbed their sweet juices. The pepper itself was also part of the dinner. 5 baking dishes had kept the family gathered around the table, passed through the church basement, and carried warmth to a neighbor's door. Then the story left Iowa for Reading, Pennsylvania. The meal returned to the sound of fat sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, and portions of food that still had work to do the following day. Canned fish, hot grease, and the skillet that never truly cold Reading, Pennsylvania, in 1951. In the home of a machine shop worker, the cast-iron skillet remained on the stove nearly all week. Beside it stood a jar of cloudy fat, a small knife, and the recipe box with a dark oil stain on one corner. She pulled the box down. One card read, salmon, crackers, egg. Another read, roast, potatoes, onion. The penciled line said nothing about quantities or cooking times. What was missing already existed in the rhythm of her wrist, the pressure of her fingers, and the sound of fat beneath the skillet. The remaining food would return in a new form. Dish number 10, salmon patties. The first patty met the hot butter with a loud sizzle. In 1951, a 16-ounce can of salmon cost about 62 cents, while a dozen eggs cost nearly 74 cents. She opened the can, flaked the fish with a fork, and mashed the soft bones along with it. Egg and cracker crumbs were mixed in until the mixture held together just enough. If the fish mixture was still too soft, she added more crumbs. If the mixture had become dry, a little egg would soften it again. Each patty was shaped to fit the palm of her hand, placed in the skillet, and fried until both sides had a golden crust. She measured with the palm of her hand. Dish number 9, codfish cakes. The smell of salted fish slowly escaped from the buttered skillet. 15 pounds of potatoes at the time cost about 76 cents, while a dozen eggs still cost nearly 74 cents. The cod had been soaked since the night before, then shredded and mixed with mashed potatoes and egg. She shaped each cake, flattened it with her fingertips, and fried it until the edges turned golden. The potatoes softened the salty flavor and helped the fish stretch across more plates. It was a familiar dish on Friday evenings, when the smell of butter and fish lingered around the stove. Salt preserved the fish. Her hands preserved the meal. Dish number 8, pan-fried leftover roast hash. On Monday morning, the cast-iron skillet still held traces of the previous night's dinner. Beef chuck roast cost about 73 cents a pound, while a large sack of potatoes cost nearly $1. She chopped the meat, mixed it with potatoes and onion, then pressed the mixture into the hot fat. The spatula moved across the surface of the skillet, then everything was left undisturbed so a crust could form. When the bottom was firm enough, she turned the mixture over in sections, allowing the other side to meet the heat. The children saw a new breakfast instead of yesterday's leftover meat. The crust created a new meal. The following morning, still in Reading in 1951, that same mother continued standing beside the cast-iron skillet. The jar of fat, the small knife, and the recipe box remained in their usual places, waiting for garden vegetables and the next day's cornmeal. Garden greens, cornmeal, and the work left for the next day. The next morning in that Reading kitchen, the cast-iron skillet was still sitting on the stove. Mother was the same woman who had shaped the fish cakes and pressed the leftover roast against the dark iron the night before. The jar of fat stood beside the recipe box. The small knife rested on the cutting board, and the smell of onions still lingered in the kitchen curtains like a trace of the meal that had just passed. Dish number 7, wilted lettuce salad. Hot bacon fat touched the greens, making the entire bowl give a faint sizzle. In 1951, a head of lettuce in Reading cost about 16 cents, while bacon cost nearly 67 cents per pound. She tore each leaf by hand, then let the greens drain in the bowl. Bacon was fried until the edges were crisp, after which she stirred vinegar and sugar into the still hot fat. The sharp scent rose, mingling with the aroma of browned meat and the warmth from the skillet. The dressing was poured over the greens just before serving, softening the leaves while allowing them to remain firm beneath the tip of a fork. She tossed them quickly and carried the bowl to the table. The bowl could not wait long. Dish free cornmeal mush. The moment a cold slice of cornmeal mush touched the hot fat, it gave off a sharp, crisp sizzle. Cornmeal cost about 9.6 cents per pound at the time, while lard cost nearly 24.6 cents per pound. The night before, she had cooked the cornmeal until very thick, poured it into a mold, and left it to cool. That morning, The firm loaf was removed, cut into even slices, and placed in the skillet. She waited until a crust formed on the bottom before turning each slice, allowing both sides to become golden and crisp. Some families poured syrup over the top. Others served the slices beside eggs or beans. Yesterday's softness had become today's crisp crust. Salmon, cod, roast meat, garden lettuce, and cold cornmeal had all passed through the same skillet. Each one found its next task. Near the bottom of the recipe box, the sound of sizzling fat gradually faded. Still ahead were rice, tomatoes, eggs, potatoes, and warm milk. Tomatoes, elbow macaroni, and the recipe cards near the Ballon of the Box, Bangor, Maine, in the winter of 1951. In the home of a paper mill worker, evenings near the end of the month often passed more quietly. Outside the window, the cold wind swept past the eaves. Rice, macaroni, canned tomatoes, a few eggs, and potatoes remained in the cupboard. The refrigerator held a little milk and a partially used piece of butter. Mother pulled down the recipe box for the last time. One card had been stained red by tomato juice. Another bore a streak of dried mustard. Near the bottom of the box was a penciled line: bread, milk, butter. The final 5 dishes still belonged to that same mother, in that same Bangor kitchen. By the end of the month, the meals grew smaller, but the care remained whole. Dish number 5, Spanish style, tomato rice. The rice turned pink as the tomatoes simmered around the bottom of the skillet. In 1951, rice cost about 18 cents a pound, while a can of tomatoes cost nearly 19 cents. She softened onion and bell pepper in a little fat, added the dry rice, and stirred until each grain became glossy. The tomatoes and their liquid were poured in, the lid was closed, and the heat was lowered. The warmth carried the smell of cooked onion through the room, while the rice gradually absorbed the red liquid. Beef or bacon could be added when available, but the rice and tomatoes alone were enough to make a filling meal. Red color entered every grain of rice. Dish number 4, macaroni with tomatoes. A piece of butter melted slowly in the pot of pale red macaroni. Macaroni at the time cost about 17 cents a pound, while 2 cans of tomatoes could be sold for 29 cents in some advertisements from the early 1950s. She boiled the macaroni until just tender, drained it, and returned it to the pot. Tomatoes, butter, and a pinch of sugar were added afterward. The spoon stirred gently so the tubes of macaroni kept their shape. Some households preferred the tomato flavor softened with sugar. Others left the tartness unchanged. That proportion lived in the family's taste rather than being fully recorded on paper. 3 ingredients still made a dinner. Dish number 3, e.g. salad sandwiches. The wax paper opened with a rustle, releasing the smell of egg and mustard. A dozen eggs in Bangor that year cost about 70 cents, while bread cost nearly 16 cents a pound. She boiled the eggs, cooled them in water, peeled and mashed them with mayonnaise, mustard, salt, and pepper. When pickles remained in the cupboard, she chopped them finely and mixed them into the filling. The mixture was spread evenly over the bread and wrapped in wax paper. One batch of eggs could go into lunch boxes, accompany the family on a picnic, or become dinner on a day when the kitchen needed to rest. 1 batch of eggs lasted all week. At the far end of the kitchen, potatoes began to boil with small popping sounds. The lid of the pot trembled gently. Then milk was poured into an enamel cup, ready for the final 2 dishes before the house settled into bedtime. Potatoes, warm milk, the quiet before bedtime. It was still the same Bangor kitchen in the winter of 1951. The mother stood beside the pot that had appeared in the previous section, listening as the sound of the potatoes simmering beneath the lid gradually softened. Outside the window, the cold wind swept across the glass. Inside, the low light drew the room inward around the stove, the ladle, and the white enamel bowl waiting on the table. Dish number 2. Potato. The potatoes broke apart softly beneath the back of the spoon, while steam fogged a small section of glass above the sink. That year, 15 pounds of potatoes cost between 76 cents and $1.14, depending on the city, while a quart of milk cost about 22 cents. She peeled the potatoes, cut them into pieces, and simmered them with onions and milk. Once the potatoes were tender, she used the back of the spoon to press some of them against the side of the pot. The sound of metal touching enamel came slowly and steadily, while the soup gradually thickened. Butter, salt, and pepper were added at the end, just enough for the rising heat to carry the mild scent of onions throughout the kitchen. When another person came through the door, she poured in a little more milk and stirred gently. The pot still held its thickness and remained warm enough for everyone to receive a serving. The soup pot always had room for one more bowl. Dish number 1, milk toast. The clock ticked on the wall as the bread gradually softened in the milk. 1 pound of bread in Bangor in 1951 cost about 16 cents, but the quart of milk cost between 22 and 23 cents. Of all the dishes on the list, this one looked the least like a recipe. Bread, milk, a little butter, sugar, salt, or cinnamon, depending on the person sitting in front of the bowl. The value of the dish lay in an act more basic than any of the techniques that came before it, placing something warm in front of someone in the household. She toasted the bread until the outside was slightly dry, then tore it directly into the enamel bowl. The milk was warmed until a thin layer of steam began to rise, before the surface started to tremble strongly. She poured it slowly over each piece of bread. A small piece of butter melted in the center, while the little spoon touched the side of the bowl with a clear, gentle sound. That bowl might be for a child with a fever, an older person who had grown tired, or a worker returning home with no desire for a heavy meal. It carried just enough warmth, the mild scent of milk, and the feeling that someone was still paying attention. She still placed something warm on the table. The final 5 dishes had moved from rice to macaroni, from waxed paper to the potato pot, and then stopped in a bowl of milk. The kitchen now held only the low light, softened bread, the thin steam from the milk, and the spoon that had just come to rest against the rim of the bowl. The entire house was slowly preparing for sleep. 30 dishes passed by through small movements. Applesauce blended into batter, and 3 small wells waited for vinegar in the pan. Beef darkened after the end-of-shift whistle, rice swelled out of the meatballs, and a spoon drew a clean path through white sauce. Potatoes held the last of the ham, salmon was shaped by hand, and hot fat touched the lettuce leaves, red macaroni rested in the pot, and then milk was poured into a bowl before bedtime. Brown, thicken, simmer slowly, divide evenly, but let rest, and save what could still be used. They measured by hand, judged by smell, listened to the oil, and watched the thickness of the sauce. She did not need to open the recipe. She needed to know what the kitchen was saying. The scent of cinnamon from York County in 1951 still lingered in the kitchen curtains. The card labeled Milk Toast 1951 returned to the bottom of the box beside an old milk stain. The lid came down, leaving the corner of the card visible. The box was always opened at dinner time. If you have ever cooked that dish, write its name in the comments. Subscribe to Old American Kitchen so that when the box opens again, there will still be a seat at the table. Some recipes were never written down because the hands had known them for a long time.